This is introducing Rita Teal tonight for the third time. I'm sure every one of you know her, but we're very proud to have her back for the third time. She does such a fantastic job. So I'm not going to say anything about your program.
All right.
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Dave.
All on yours.
Well, I am going to speak as loud as I can, and my first question is, can you hear me at the back? Got it. All right. Then the second thing is, because I am height challenged, I'm going to do what I did last time. And also take off my shoes, which are killing me. I tried to be grown up and wear heels, and it doesn't work very well. And my talk tonight is on something that you see every time that you go into the Annisquam Village Hall. And the first slide, as you walk in, you see a backdrop on the stage, and you see Margaret Fitzhugh Brown's paintings. But what you probably don't realize is that there are a fair number of paintings from other folks other than Margaret Fitzhugh Brown. And what happened was David and I, my husband over here, decided that really it would be a good idea just to document which pictures were in the Village Hall, and if reproductions of those images could generate some income for the preservation and conservation of that artwork. And a photographic file would allow research on the paintings and or the artists. So we suggested this to Steve and to the Annisquam Village Hall Association this year, and they took that up and said, fine, that's great. So Steve became a willing participant in this documentation. So we set up camera, we set up flashes, we had fancy umbrellas, which I'm not showing you here. I was the photographic assistant. I did what I was told most of the time. And we took photographs of all of the paintings that were up in the Village Hall, or are up in the Village Hall. Now you can see, just by looking at this slide, maybe that the ones on the far wall are a little different than Margaret Fitzhugh Brown's. This is me looking very serious. We had taken one of the paintings down. I'm holding a gray card so that the image can be sorted out later in terms of its appropriate density, etc. And I'm also studying hard the painting because I'm holding up a level. We put the paintings on a horizontal surface, put a padding underneath, and the person behind was Kilroy. So, bless his heart, Steve Harris was the picture holder in the back. We don't have one of those fancy gizmos that the museums have. So Steve helped us out with all of this. And what I wanted to call this talk was really hidden in plain view, because you see them every day, but they're the wallpaper of Annisquam Community Center. This is part one, and the reason for doing this in two parts, if you'll have me back in the spring, is that there are actually 9 artists whose art is represented in the hall, other than Tom Houck and Sean McNiff, who I should mention did the backdrop. So there are 9 other artists. I'm going to discuss 4 today. I'm going to talk about George Wainwright Harvey. Many of you will recognize that name immediately. Melbourne Havelock Hardwick, great name, I'll go into that. Alice Roney Hardwick, and Rosamond, did I say it right, Sarah?
No.
No. I've been practicing. Okay, say it for me.
Rosmond.
Rosamond. Is that better? Rosamond.
Yes.
Lombard, Smith, Bouvet. George Wainwright Harvey lived from 1855 to 1930. And the interesting thing about him, of course, is that he's a Gloucester native. And he's one of the artists who I think should start off this discussion because he comes from here, from Gloucester. This is the label on his painting, Beach in Holland by George Harvey, gift of Elliot C. Rogers. Most of the paintings have a label, one doesn't. Some of them explain where the gift came from. The dates are variable, and sometimes it's hard to know whether the date that's provided on a label is of the painting or of the gift. This one, of course, has no dates on it. And this is the painting, which is a charming painting. And I actually didn't pay much attention to it until we photographed it and held it and looked at it carefully. It almost looks like a watercolor, but it's an oil. There are two people chatting each other up on a beach in Holland. Okay, now how do you know it's Holland? Well, the interesting thing is that the boat has KW on it, KW 54. And there's a book that you can find on the net that tells you what boat numbers and letters mean. So I looked this up, and it comes from Katwijk. Now listen to the Dutch for this to be able to say it properly, I hope. Don't ask me to spell it, okay? It's a whole different language. But it's from Katwijk Beach, and this is his gift via Elliot Rogers to the Annisquam Village Hall. But look at this. Isn't this fabulous? This is in part due to Mary Ellen's work and Jane Harris, who had scanned this several years ago. Steve can tell you, it's probably about 15 years ago, I would think. And it's a photograph of Martha and Harvey and a boat which says KW on it. This one is 22, the other one was 54, and the boat pattern is a little different in terms of its quality of upkeep. But it's exactly the same. And these were the boats that were used for fishing in the North Sea off of this beach. These two spent 2 years almost after their marriage in 1884. They went to Holland, which was different than most of the painters of that era who went to Paris, who went to France. So they became part of a whole school of Dutch art, which was called Dutch Impressionism, Dutch Luminism, if you will. They made great friends, and George became an honorary member of one of the societies at The Hague, a society that in fact had had a showing of Van Gogh's work several years before. So an important position to be in. He must have enjoyed his time there very much. This is to orient you as to where this place is. You can see how it's spelled. And The Hague is relatively close by. And this is where he painted, and where many of the pictures, etchings, and sketches come from that are up in the Exchange Gallery on the top floor of the Exchange. This label connects us with Elliot Rogers, and I am sure that there are folks in the audience who knew Elliot Rogers. So I wanted to just make that connection, and people can talk about him later. He was a lawyer, and he managed the Harvey estate because the Harveys had no children. And I just thought I would put this little piece from Peter Anastas in. Though retired from post office or bank, they, old men, always seem dressed up to us kids. Many, like our family's lawyer, Elliot Rogers, wearing Tattersall shirts and knitted woolen neckties. And I can just see this gentleman, but look at him. You know, I'll show you an earlier picture of him. He's a very handsome young gentleman. Interesting thing in the census of 1940, now Elliot Rogers lived till 1970, he's listed as having florist industry. And so maybe somebody in the audience knows why that particular designation for his career or his job got listed in the census. Very strange. His wife's name was Helen. I wondered if she had a florist shop or something like that. But maybe that's a mystery to me, so maybe somebody can solve it. This is what he looked like as a young man. And again, Jane Harris had scanned this image, and so it's for us to enjoy. And we owe a lot to him. He really helped in presenting all of the Harvey material to this village. Many people have thought that George Wainwright Harvey must have spent a fair amount of time on the sea, sailing boats or being on schooners, but this is a copy of a letter written about 1866-67. It's in the archives of the Cape Ann Museum. When I was 11, I cried and sulked until I got the consent of my mother, and I and Ed, his brother, shipped and went a-fishing. All the boys did then, and my brothers also. I was large for my age, larger than I am now, in fact, but 4 weeks, knocking about in the Bay of Fundy, fog, seasick all the time, rather changed my desire, and one trip was enough. So he obviously lived by the sea. He went to Holland. He had to get there by boat, but I don't think he enjoyed the fishing out of Gloucester very much. This is a map from 1917 to 1919 of the Cove area, and it's to show you that Harvey, whose house is down at the lower right, they actually have in small letters here, studio. And the reason I put him down the lower right is to orient you to Bridgewater Street at the top and then River Road, which had become River Road by that point. Just about 5 or 6 years before that, it was still called Curve Street. It's already River Road, and the Harvey house is on that wharf looking out at the cove. And this is what it looked like from a distance. And this is an older entry to just remind you that if you see Curve Street, it's the same as River Road in the old documents. It's the house that's on the wharf. I think you can all appreciate the brown house that stands out right there. And the house that Sheila Higgins, I'm not sure if she's here tonight, she's at 50, which is the house way over on the right. And then Curve Street, of course, takes quite a bend, and I never really appreciated it until I saw some of these photographs. George still had a sailboat. He may not have liked fishing, but this is a photograph from the Annisquam Historical Society with one of the cats that lived at their house. Now, say, I'm hearing sighs from some folks in the audience. There were many cats, and Sarah can tell you how many she counted when she was a child. But the cat and George and the sailboat seemed to be a trio, and he loved animals very much. In fact, when you look at the house now, it doesn't look very different. The skylights, which were on that little map and on that photograph, have gone. But where he used to feed a pet gull was probably that little porch area that is out the back. He was known for feeding the birds. So this is the Harvey house. It was immediately prior to being the Harvey's house owned by Alpheus Hyatt, who ran a biological laboratory and school out of this house. Apparently, pollution in the cove was a major problem, and that's part of the reason that the whole enterprise moved to Woods Hole. So this is the genesis of the Woods Hole Institute. So George Wainwright Harvey is well known at the Cape Ann Museum, of course, because he's a local painter. He is known also for his etchings, and I included this, but you might be able to see from the back, but I'll read it. Etchings were a source of income for artists between sales of paintings. And this gentleman, George Wainwright Harvey, sold more than 40 etchings at the 1925 exhibition of the North Shore Art Association. So that was a very good means of income, and many of them are small because he had a small press. And again, you'll see examples of that in the Annisquam exchange. He did paint views of the village. And I put this up just to show you that his art comes up every so often in auction. This is a Skinner slide, auction slide. This is from 2012. This was sold in 2012 for $1,659, and obviously is a view of the church, which many artists did. So his work does come up, and he did do work en plein air, even when it was frosty plein air. I haven't seen any of his snow paintings. I'm not an artist, I'm not an art historian, so maybe others of you have seen some of his paintings in snow, but he obviously took it seriously enough to be out there. And of course, the wind is whipping the trees around a little bit, so they're blurry in this longer exposure. I went looking for his gravestone, and I couldn't find it because I thought it would be under Harvey. and it wasn't, is under the Rogers plot in Mount Adna Cemetery. So if you go up there, he died, alas, from Hodgkin's disease. That's what his death certificate mentions. And at his memorial service, it was said, if the dumb birds and beasts that he fed for 50 years could speak, they would call him the St. Francis of Annisquam. I thought that was a lovely comment and brought something back to us in terms of what he was like as a person. Martha Harvey is buried beside him. The stone is a little hard to see, actually, but they're in Mount Adna Cemetery under the Rogers stone, under the Rogers plot. I'm going to move along to this wonderful name of Melbourne Havelock Hardwick. Now, he was from Nova Scotia, and I thought, where on earth did he get those names? Well, Melbourne is a small town in Nova Scotia near Yarmouth, and as is Havelock, and he came from Digby. So I don't know whether somebody was having fun or whether somebody had had too much Nova Scotia, whatever they drink up there, and who knows. But that's his name, and it's an unusual name. There aren't very many folks with his name, which was easy. When you come to the internet, tell you, those are great. I know there are some Smiths in the crowd, and I don't want to see a Smith to look up on the internet. It's really tough. This is his painting. It's called Dutch Interior. Now you may wonder why I put him right after George Wainwright Harvey, and you'll see. It was the gift of Mrs. Philip Edward Coyle. We'll come back to her later. This is the painting, and it's extremely dark. In fact, you've probably walked by it and not even seen it, because if it's in the shadows, you can't see it at all. There's a lot of surface density on it, which may be varnish. We tried to lighten it up digitally, just to give you an idea of what, in fact, this picture was of. And you can see it's a lot of streaky density, and in fact, if you look at this sideways, you can see drips of something on it. And it's a woman in the Netherlands peeling potatoes. She's actually taken off her clogs. Very difficult to see, but the clogs are on the floor, and she's got her feet on a little stool. And I think the potatoes are going into that bucket, but if I'm correct, I think potatoes usually sink. And the only thing I can see is things floating on the top. So, but this is his painting, and he started off not in art, but in jewelry carving. He came from Nova Scotia, obviously worked in some kind of an artisanal capacity, and studied drawing at the Lowell Institute and the Zepho Club. Now, I did not know about this, but the Lowell Institute, which was founded by the Lowell family, the son of the original Lowell, after whom the town is named, the city is named. Louder. Got it. The Lowell Institute provided lectures, and in fact, WGBH came out of the Lowell Institute. That was its beginnings. And drawing classes were provided at the Museum of Fine Arts as part of the Lowell Institute educational programs. The Zepho Club was sounds like just a all-comers kind of club who could bring in a model, and any artists who were in the town at the time could sketch or draw from a live model. So very helpful for young artists in Boston to have these two institutions. Because he became so proficient in watercolor, he ended up as an instructor. And this is his painting that is in the Annisquam Exchange on the top floor that I'll bet you nobody has ever seen. No, right, because again, it's part of the wallpaper. Now, you can see that...
Is the other painting also in the Exchange?
Of his?
The Wainwright, the Harvey painting?
Yes, but not of Melbourne Hardwick. So Hardwick looks like he's got boats that are getting familiar to you, all right, and a big beach. So it turns out that he also was interested in Holland. He worked in Boston at the Studio Building, which was destroyed by fire. Apparently artists' buildings seem to go up in smoke pretty easily, but probably turpentine and oil paints were a pretty good means of combustion. He spent summers in Annisquam. It's noted in one of his little biographies. And he also lived on Curve Road, 21. Where's 21? Well, if you go around the corner, it's at the bottom right. It's where Dick Norton lives now. It's just across that way from the Barnacle. And it's on the map, it's listed as Hardwick Studio. So it was specifically his place. The other important thing is that David managed to pick out from an old photograph what probably was the original house, and I've enlarged it at the bottom here. And it was right on the seawall. Currently, if you look at it from the seawall, this is what it looks like. So does everybody recognize that house? You don't usually see it from this angle, but I went down on the docks to get a picture of it. Now, the other important factor here was that he visited Holland, England, and Nova Scotia to paint. He also was not a Francophile. And if you look at this painting again, there's not only the boats that look just like the boats that George Harvey painted. That church is iconic. So I started looking for the church. And sure enough, it's in the same town. So now they're 2 years different in age. George Harvey, Mr. Hardwick. Did they meet in Holland? Did George say, come back to Annisquam because there's this great house that's down the road that you could set up a studio in? Where was the connection? Which one came first? And it would take a lot of digging, and neither of these folks had any children, so there's not easy papers to acquire, to investigate. But I think it's fascinating that these two people who were in this village painted the same area. Now, Mrs. Philip Edward Coyle, who was she? Major Philip Coyle, and some of you might remember him, I don't know. He was at Harvard, and this is from a Harvard alumni publication, but it mentions that he worked for Mr. Height. Now, if Chan Davis were here, he would tell you that the Height estate was where he lived. It's the big house up in the hill in Adams Hill Road. One of the things that I realized was that it was terribly difficult to find the women in all of this. This is Mrs. Philip Coyle. And this is my little, as they say in New Zealand, my wee rant. Because in the preface to 1908 Who's Who, they actually said we'd hoped to add the Christian and maiden names of the ladies. It seemed to us quite fitting that some notice be taken of a wife's presence other than that which the bare Mrs. in Mr. and Mrs. gave. But so many hesitated sending this information that before we went to press, not half had replied. Responses are coming in daily, however, and we hope to incorporate this feature next year. This is what's interesting. The responses were very prompt from Pride's Crossing, Beverly Farms, Manchester, and that section, but in the vicinity of Marblehead and Cape Ann, the percentage was so small, we were led to abandon the plan for this year. So what were the, there's a whole sociology paper right there. This is in 1908. Now, very complicated slide, but it's just to show you the North Shore Who's Who in 1908 had Mr. and Mrs. Coyle. By 1915, Mrs. Coyle was Edith Woodbury. Then I get the social register for 1919. It's Major Coyle because he'd been to France with the First World War. And then the Harvard Alumni Bulletin mentions in 1960 that Philip Edward Coyle died in Annisquam. So that's why I'm mentioning him in particular. His wife survives. So the painting is given by Mrs. coil, and I'm assuming that it was possibly given sometime around the 1960s, but I don't know. Mr. Hardwick did do other pictures, of course, and other paintings, and this is a lovely view that's taken. I took it from artnet.com, and it was Summer on the Coast, and it was a lovely view up the Annisquam River from the hill across the cove. The other point that I wanted to make about him was his claim to fame for many, especially in the art books, was that he had a painting hanging in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. That gives him, mana. This painting was decided to be deaccessioned from the Museum of Fine Arts, and so it was sold for almost $50,000 in 2006. So it was not kept by the museum, and so his place there has essentially disappeared. I don't know where it went. He did not have an easy end. Yeah, everybody who remembers what McLean Hospital in Belmont looked like in the old days. So in the Boston Evening Transcript from 1916, it says, after an illness of several months from a nervous trouble. Now, what the death certificate, actually he probably died in McLean from a coronary thrombosis or a heart attack. But the situation was such, I think, in that era, in terms of mental health, that Melbourne Havelock Hardwick did not die in Belmont. He died in Boston, and on his plaque, which also is in Mount Adna. And I thank my daughter Eleanor, if she's still here, for running around the entire cemetery and finding him and finding the rest of the family, because in the 1916 obituary, Mr. Hardwick leaves a wife. Okay? So luckily, now, here's another story. Alice Roney Hardwick, 1876 to 1932. Now, if you remember any of the dates, I'm terrible on dates, but 76 was interesting because that's quite a bit later than her husband was born. And the map that says 1917 and 1919 is actually after Mr. Hardwick dies. She's still continuing the studio, and it's her studio, not his. So the Hardwick studio became well known on the North Shore, with Mrs. Alice Hardwick in attendance, selling her own paintings. She was Alice Irene Roney. This is her marriage certificate from the census, or from the internet rather. She was 32 when she got married. Her husband was 51, so almost 20 years different. They got married in New Hampshire, I'm not sure why, but it also luckily had her father's name and mother's name. This is what her signature looks like. Very strong, angular signature. She was born in Chicago, studied in New York, and her teacher included Melbourne Hardwick. So she married her teacher. They traveled and painted in Holland and Belgium. Many of her paintings are of beach scenes of the northern coast of Holland. So ties these families together again. Her painting was down here in the library, and thanks to Dee Dee and Judy Junker, we rescued it. And the reason it was down here is because it had been carried down during one of the plays, performances, something happening in the village hall when all the paintings were moved out. And hers was left down here forlornly. We don't know for how long, but we spotted it, and it had the label on it just like the others did upstairs. Alice Hardwick, gift of the artist, apple blossoms. And luckily we actually had an old photograph in our family photographs which showed it in the village hall. And this is what it looked like. Now, It's a lovely painting. I like Alice. She's one of my favorite people. And you know, what happens is when you start looking into the lives of these folks, you start thinking, what a great story these people have. The question is, can you figure out where it is? And I'll tell you, the Gloucester newspapers used to say the artists are arriving because it's apple blossom time. And the Cape was covered in apple trees, especially around here. So do you know where this is?
Arlington Street.
Absolutely. So this is what it looks like now. Unfortunately, not in apple blossom time. There are some apple trees left on the right. The very tall one actually is an apple tree. And if you look, it's the junction of River Road and Arlington Street. And if you look at them side by side, it's of course slightly different vantage point, but remember where their studio was. It's right there, where where she's doing the painting. And in the close-up, which I'll show you here, you can still see the fence. It's the same, very similar construction. And that little window, you appreciate in the painting there's a little window there? That was the root cellar for the apples, and that's the cellar on which the house, which is now present, was built. Interesting things happen when you go around the internet. When I started looking up Hardwick, Alice Hardwick, it got mixed up with her husband's paintings. And interestingly, this painting that I'm showing you down the bottom is actually his painting. He favored purple. So that's Melbourne Hardwick. So you can see them sitting side by side, and he's going, purple, 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 purple. No, Melbourne. That's too much purple. I much prefer the white. Now the painting up on the left there is not the one that's here. She was on a good thing. She painted a lot of those. This one was one that was sold in Virginia. And it's virtually same painting as it's in the Village Hall. So apple blossoms turned out to be a very good subject for both of these folks. Now, in the U.S. Census from 1930, by now she's a widow, and it talks about Alice M. Hardwick. Her age is slightly different, but she's with a Roney, who's her brother. I can find that, and she's out in California. She's listed as an artist on this census, and she's working in a studio. So what I don't know, and maybe somebody does, is if the census taker, if somebody was working that day, like our friend Alice down at the studio, did somebody in the house just say, oh yes, Alice lives here too, she's a boarder. I think she's about 50-something, 50-odd. Did that happen, or did people have to be in the house to have their census taker check them off? I don't know that. So anybody has that information, it would be interesting. She's also Alice M, where she shouldn't be Alice M. She's Alice Irene. But this is her obituary. Well-known artist, dies in Brookline. She actually died in a Christian Science Benevolent Association that was in Chestnut Hill. She had been there for some time, but the obituary in the Gloucester Daily Times talks about her being an important person in the village, Mrs. Hardwick, whose death is a serious loss to the village and to the world of Arge, is survived by a sister and a brother, Frank Roney of Los Angeles, the one that I think she was with for a while. She was also a singer and apparently used to entertain the local folks with her good voice. So that was Alice, and her plaque, died in Annisquam, but born in Oak Park, Illinois, is in line with her husband's. Her mother also died in Annisquam, so was obviously staying with her at that time. Her name was Albertine Stone Roney, and her father is buried there, or his ashes are buried there. Interestingly, I just included this little newspaper article at the top just to remind me to tell you that he was a very wealthy man. He was in charge of development of mining claims in Mexico. So Alice probably got to art school based on family money. She was not probably a starving art student. When one wanders around the internet, as you well know, you find things that seem to have absolutely no relationship. And I was looking for Alice Hardwick. I don't know whether you can see my search up there, but it's Alice Hardwick Images. And I thought, well, that lady with the bowling hat on there down there is probably not Alice Hardwick, because I was trying to find some photographs of them. We have Martha and George. It would have been nice to have gotten Melbourne and Alice. But right at the corner here, there's this little book that says something. So I thought, what is that? And it's called Little Wooden Shoes by Alice Hardwick. I go, okay. Pictures by Frances Brundage. Now, I had no clue who Frances Brundage was. I've learned a lot, you can tell, this last month. But Alice Hardwick, I thought, oh, she didn't usually write books, but she certainly knew about Dutch scenery, Dutch costume. So I tried to find Frances Brundage. Luckily, we had photographed all of the pictures around Annisquam Village Hall, and I remembered that there was one that was the gift of Mr. and Mrs. W.T. Brundage. Could it be related? Please, yes. It'll make such a great story. Well, it did. Mr. and Mrs. W.T. Brundage, Annisquam River Road, they're all here. Winter Residence, Washington, D.C. Mrs. Brundage was Frances Lockwood. I thought, oh, this is really good. Who was Frances Lockwood Brundage? She lived from 1854 to 1937. She was taught art by her father, whose first name was Rembrandt. I mean, you couldn't get away from that. Rembrandt Lockwood. She began working as an artist at 17 because her father abandoned the family. She was left to make the money. She married artist William Tyson Brundage, W.T., and had one child, Mary. I've highlighted that. You have to remember that name, who died at 17 months. I always remember that name because it was my husband's girlfriend, but that's another story. Get a smile at it. Postcards and valentines made her famous, 1899 to 1910. She was the most famous illustrator in that genre during that time. She sold buckets of illustrations. She worked for publishers Gabriel and Salfield thereafter. Now, I have here, if I can find it, something to donate to the library. It's called A Bit of Brundage. And it's all of the, or not all of them, but many of the illustrations that she put together. So if you want to pass that around, you can. Okay, just to take a look. It's just Victoriana. On the internet, Frances Brundage is said to be this lady on the left. The problem is that if you look carefully at the writing, it says Miss Frances. And this was done in 1917, and she was married. I think that's been a major mistake that's been perpetuated throughout everything that's noted about Frances Brundage. So nothing, you have to take everything very carefully when you start doing this. And in fact, in this book, they show a picture that's the same as Frances Brundage here, which is on the French Wikipedia site. So I think the French got it correct. I think we didn't get it quite right in English. We think that's Frances Brundage. It's from the Smithsonian, so I'm going to take that as credible evidence. So I've at least got a picture, I think, of her. This is a picture when she's older and mentioned in a magazine article because she's so famous. And I thought for today, because of the coming holiday, that I would just take a photograph of some of her Halloween illustrations, which are in the book. So Frances Brundage, very important in terms of who she was. She lived in Annisquam on Curve Street. Luckily, Mr. Brundage, who's who in art, gets mentioned at living at 15 River Road. Anybody know where that is? So this is where the Brundages were. So now you've got a line of people, the Harveys, the Hardwicks, and the Brundages. We have no, yes, and a skylight too. We have no evidence that she left any paintings or illustrations here, but that wasn't her oeuvre. I am sure, however, that Alice gave her the story about this child in Holland, and that Frances illustrated it because she was so good as a children's illustrator, and Alice really just did landscapes. And notice the story here features a little girl named Mary, and that's the child that Frances lost. So I am pretty sure that I think circumstantial evidence puts those two people together in the same road and in the same effort here. Nothing in the book, I have a copy of the book if anybody wants to see it later. It's a very small, slight book, and it doesn't give any information about author or illustrator. It's just a plain picture book. Now, to come to the finale, I've got 20 minutes left, I think. Okay, Sarah, how do you say this? Rosman. I'm waking her up there. Lombard. Smith Bouvet is my last artist for the evening. She lived from 1876 to 1948. Now, in the Village Hall is this painting. And I had no idea who this was, and there's no label on it, either in the front or the back. And I must admit to not having known at all who Rosamond Bouvet was. And you can see the signature. I'll show it to you maybe in close-up. It's pretty faint with this light, so don't worry about it. But the signature is there. I thought, okay, I'll have to start looking her up. So I started on the internet again. And by luck, I found this on the internet, which mentions Rosamond Bouvet and her family. So I ordered the book, and I got it, and there's a portrait, a photograph here, and a portrait below, and it says here, courtesy of Sarah Hackett. So I had gone the entire thousands of miles around in the ether, spent my money, and found out that I should walk 3 doors down. And then I called Sarah. I was so excited. I called Sarah, and I called her when she was trying to take her nap. And she said, people who know me don't wake me up. So I am apologizing in public again for waking her up. But I'm very glad that I got to know Sarah because she gave me all of the information about this family. And I met the Baldwins. Now I've met Janelle and Tom. So this is the collection of Sarah Hackett, and Rosamond is the lady who's turned just to her left, and her sister Eleanor is the other white dressed lady with a lovely hat. And this was a family portrait taken, not sure what year. Rosamond's brother is Frederick, who's up in the corner. Now, this, Sarah lent me her book on Rosamond, which had been through the fire. So, I got it. I managed to get to the Cape Ann Museum, and they still had some. So this is for Sarah, without fire on it. You can pass it back. But all of the information, really, about the family comes from Sarah, and the information that was put together by Sandra Lepore and Britt Cruz, who was the curator at that time. There was a wonderful exhibit, I wish I had known about, well, we weren't here at the time, but in 1993 there was a wonderful exhibit of her work at the Cape Ann Museum. This woman was a beautiful woman, absolutely stunning. And she enrolled at the Museum of Fine Arts School at 17 years of age. Her teachers were important folks, Edmund Tarbell, Philip Hale, Frank Benson. She also became so good at her art that she was one of the few women instructors at the MFA school. She did travel to Europe this was the rite of passage for artists at that time, of course. And she went to the Fenway Studios after the Harcourt building fire. I mentioned the Tremont Street building had gone up in flames. The Harcourt Street did too. And the problem with these fires, of course, the artists lost everything. And they lost their work, not just their tools, but their work. The Fenway Studios, if you haven't been there, I had never seen it. And we found the front door. It faces the turnpike. So you can't, it's a chain link fence actually in its front yard now. There's a road and a chain link fence. And you can't really appreciate the entire building, which is a lovely arts and crafts building with all of these north-facing windows. But I think you can see how elegant the doorway is. And it's now a National Historic Landmark. And by doing this, they've been able to get funds for keeping it going, in a sense.
You know who the architect was?
No, not right now. I can look it up. She enrolled at the MFA school, as I mentioned. She commuted by train to teach at Miss Porter's school. So this in Farmington, Connecticut, while she worked at the Fenway Studios on the weekends. Then she got a job working at Miss May School in Boston, which was much easier in terms of working around where she lived. I didn't realize the Fenway Studios were also places to live. You didn't just have to have your studio there, you could live there. And this is where she spent her summer holidays. This is Squam Rock Cottage. That's the first big house as you go up Squam Rock Road. Now this is where the story gets interesting in the sense that her last name is Bouvet. And the person on the left is Tom Bouvet, who had married Pauline Rust in 1898. So these two really didn't get together. He had also, I found out they had a daughter named Anne in 1900. This is Tom and his wife Pauline. Sounds like she was a writer as well. He was an editor, writer, etc. But as of 1924, they were able to link up and get married. Now, in 1919, she was not married, and I think this is a rather poignant picture that she painted that's called The Wedding Dress. It's a very famous painting, and it was featured in the Woman's Home Companion. And it was thought that it might make a very nice wedding present, I'm sure for somebody from New York or Newport. So this was her painting from 1919. But she did marry Tom Bouvet in 1924, and she moved to New York City. So she essentially severed her connection with the Boston artistic groups and went to New York and redeveloped her art there, became known there, and was very successful there. And this is Tom Bouvet reading the newspaper as painted by his wife Rosamond. And I think it's a lovely painting. I've seen it. It's just lovely. Of course, it's not in black and white. It's color. In 1941, Tom died, and Rosamond's sister also, her husband died within about 3 days of each other. So they returned to Annisquam in 1941, and they moved into a house on Union Court. This is written by Britt in that little booklet, where Rosamond spent the rest of her life. She renewed her friendship with Annisquam photographer Martha Rogers Harvey, whose portrait she painted. She also did a portrait of long-term family friend and American historian David Seville Muzzy. And this is Dr. Muzzy, or Professor Muzzy, right here. Now, that has no label, but he is listed, Sarah recognized him, but also he's listed as having his portrait in the Annisquam Village Hall in a listing of paintings that was done in 1989 by Don Usher. So this is Mr. Muzzy, Professor Muzzy, Dr. Muzzy. I'm showing you this map because the Muzzy family in Annisquam has been here for a long time. And that little corner house Walnut Street coming down to Leonard Street, you can see Anna Muzzy listed on that property. All right. So this is what the house looks like. So now everybody goes, of course, we know that house. And you can see that left-hand side had been added on later. The actual other piece is around the back. Now, this is what's interesting. Professor Muzzy was really from Annisquam royalty, if you want to call it that. 1805, Reverend Ezra Leonard married Nancy Woodbury. In 1830, Anne Woodbury Leonard, their daughter, married David Seville. In 1860, their daughter, Annie Woodbury Seville, married David Wood Muzzy. Forget about the Woods, they get confusing. But then, their son, David Seville Muzzy, married Ina Bullis from New York. He went out of town. But look at this, you know, he's directly descended from Ezra Leonard. Now, their children were David and Elizabeth. And this is where I love this, because Dee Dee, I was asking her about some of these folks, and she said, oh yes, Tizzy Muzzy Larson Brown. And I thought, how fantastic a name is that? So Tizzy Elizabeth Muzzy married Mr. Larson, then married Mr. Brown. Their daughter was Ina, who was Pidgey. Okay, so Pidgey Larson married Mr. Donnan, but Pidgey was Muzzy's granddaughter, Dr. Muzzy's granddaughter. So does that all make sense now for those who have thought, how did that connect? Don't worry, there's no test at the end of it. So I wanted to just feature this. You know, Dr. Muzzy actually would take an entire hour of discussion. He was so interesting. He probably changed how people thought about American history because he wrote the textbook for the high school students in the first part of the 1900s. He was well respected. He was an ethical man and formed lots of connections through associations in New York that thought that ethics and morals were an important part of politics. Okay, that's an editorial comment. So after his first wife died, he married Emily. And Emily you will know, if you've been around for a while, as Mrs. Muzzy. She was the one that people know. Doris remembers her coming up past because she liked to watch the birds, right? Bird watcher. So there is still a connection to the Muzzies in that we now live in Mrs. Muzzy's house, which is kind of cool. Now, Union Court. I should come back to Rosamond. She moved to Union Court with her sister, and that's Union Court. And is Martha here today? I'm not sure. Martha? Oh, I went up to take a photograph, and she was not happy because I was trespassing. So I didn't get the whole house. And I apologized profusely afterward. But this is Union Court, and this is where Rosamond was living with her sister Eleanor at the end of her life. And this is where she's buried, also in Mount Adna, with her husband's ashes in a grave that is beautifully positioned. Her sister Eleanor is buried nearby. And the poem that's here, it was written by her husband Tom. Here one within this urn, no less if yet no more commingled than before, lies what of us could turn to ashes of desire. But our most rapturous part, that full resplendent flame of love we used to share, that fond and mutual fire which fused us heart to heart, burns on somehow, somewhere, unseen, but still the same. She put together, Rosamond put together his poetry into a book called The Bell and Bugle, and that was published posthumously in 1943. So what the last little bit here to tie this into a nice knot was to come back to the Rogers-Harvey connection. Annisquam photographer Martha Rogers Harvey, whose portrait she painted. Where's the portrait? We don't have it here. So, went looking for it. Talked to Stephanie Buck. She called up some people. I met a very nice young man named Leon Doucette, who works in the archives over at Cape Ann Museum. And he came up with the goods.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Martha Harvey is in the basement. But not anymore. Now she's out in the open air. So, Martha, thanks to a lot of work by folks just tracing the information, we got her on film. So thank you to David, because he did a lot of the work on getting the photography, making sure that I didn't go down too many rabbit holes when I was researching this thing. Steve has spent hours doing this. He's not only doing the videotaping, but he helped us with all the photography. He's been part of multiple discussions about all of this. So Steve I owe him a big vote of thanks. The Gloucester City Archives were fabulous people. They went after these houses for me. And that's Sarah Dunlap, Janie Walsh, and Sandy Williams. Wonderful folks who are treasures. Stephanie and Fred Buck and Leon Doucette from the Cape Ann Museum. Dee Dee and Judy, who together we've rescued the painting from Alice and got it back upstairs. Relatives of Rosamond. And this lady on the left, she gave us the opportunity to show this lovely portrait of her when she was a bit younger. Sarah Hackett, for whom this is a late birthday present.